On a quiet afternoon in rural Texas, a 28-year-old physical therapist pulled into a store parking lot after his truck broke down. He called his wife, told her exactly where he was, and waited, but just minutes later, he was gone. Witnesses said that he suddenly took off running down the highway for no clear reason. His phone went silent mid-call, but when his wife called back, she didn't get silence at first. She heard him breathing on the other end. And then all of the calls after that went unanswered. His parents arrived within minutes to an empty truck. 18 days later, his body was found under bizarre circumstances. Nothing about the scene, the timeline, or the missing evidence made sense. So what actually happened in those final minutes to Alfred Wright on that highway? And why are there still pieces of this case that don't fit even today? Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell before you go. All right, friends, let's get into today's case. Alfred Nehemiah Wright was born on March 8th, 1985 in Jasper, Texas. He grew up in that town, went to school there, played sports there, and fell in love there. Alfred was lovingly known as Alfie to those who knew him, and he was one of 6 children born to Douglas Sr. and Rosalind. Their household was grounded in faith and community, and these values were instilled in all of the Wright kids. Alfred got his boldness from his dad, and neighbors and family described him as the kind of young man who didn't shrink himself for anybody. He walked into rooms with confidence. He made people laugh, and he was the type of person that others gravitated toward without really being able to articulate why. Alfred was athletic ever since he was little, and he channeled that into football. After graduating from Jasper High School, Alfred earned a football scholarship to the University of Mary Hardin-Baylor, which is a private Baptist university in Belton, Texas. This college is about 3 hours west of Jasper. He played there before transferring to the University of Tennessee, where he eventually completed his degree in physical therapy. Getting that degree, going through the coursework, the clinical rotations, and the licensing exam was not a small accomplishment. It took significant drive and effort to do all of that, especially while playing sports. Alfred came back to East Texas with his degree and built an entire career there. He started at the Rayburn Clinic in Jasper, working as a physical therapist with patients who required hands-on rehabilitation by an expert. He was great at his job. Former patients and colleagues described him as attentive and capable, and someone who really connected with the people that he cared for. He took his professional responsibilities very seriously. Alfred transitioned away from the clinic, and he was working independently through a company called East Texas Healthcare, making house calls to homebound patients all across Jasper County and into neighboring Sabine County. He'd been building a private caseload and expanding to this new area, and that is where he was working when today's story takes place. Alfred married his childhood sweetheart, Lauren Wright. Together, they built a beautiful family in Jasper, and they had 2 precious young sons named Kingson and Kaysen. Alfred also had a son from a previous relationship, and Lauren said that Alfred was a deeply present father. He was the kind of man who showed up for his family even when life was complicated and messy. Now, to understand what happened on November 7th, 2013, I need to introduce you to one more person. Alfred was quietly struggling with addiction, and his wife was not aware of it at the time, but we'll get more into that later on. Shane Dwayne Hadnot graduated from Jasper High School with Alfred, and the two of them stayed in communication ever since. They weren't close friends, but they had a connection, and that connection had become transactional in the months before Alfred's death. Hadnot was working as a dealer in the Jasper area, primarily selling, well, let's call it coke for today's video. Starting on October 8th, 2013, Alfred Wright was texting Shane Hadnot to arrange a meetup for a purchase. The messages were coming daily, using coded language that the two men had apparently created over time. Alfred's wife, Lauren, did notice some changes in her husband during that time, but she couldn't quite figure out what was going on. She described him as paranoid, unable to settle, not himself, and she said that he seemed agitated in a way that she found difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. It's easy for any of us listening to point to these behaviors and say, these are clear signs. But remember, when you're up close to a situation, it can be very hard to see things clearly, especially when it's coming from someone that you would never expect this from. Alfred's patients were beginning to notice some changes too. In the days immediately before November 7th, at least one patient said that Alfred had arrived late to their home visit, complaining that he was feeling really sick. A second patient at a separate location said that Alfred was in their driveway extremely disoriented. He was unable to communicate clearly and unable to hold a coherent conversation, too. This was far from the professional PT that they once knew. That patient told Alfred to leave the property immediately. He felt uncomfortable because these are the signs that someone would have in significant impairment in someone who is supposed to be providing professional health care in their home. He was deteriorating and no one seemed to know or understand why. Alfred was also carrying a legal burden at the time. He was under a federal indictment in Tennessee, which stemmed from an old allegation that he had embezzled $1,000 from a bank where he was working while he was in college. His trial was scheduled for December of 2014, so more than a year away at that time. His family said that Alfred had turned down a plea deal because he maintained his innocence and he truly felt that he could prove that in court. According to Lauren, Alfred wanted this trial to happen because he was looking forward to putting this behind him. On the morning of November 7th, 2013, Alfred was scheduled for a full caseload of 10 patient visits. That is a long day of work. He made his rounds through Jasper and then he headed to Sabine County. At 12:36 p.m. that day, Alfred sent a text to his dealer, Hadnot, and said, "Bro, 1 Gino and a 20 and 30 handles." The federal investigators translated that as a gram of coke and a mixture of other heavy-hitting substances too. Alfred sent that text that early afternoon and then continued seeing the patients throughout the day. This was the same day that he was sent home by one of his patients. Whether the drugs were already in his system by that point or maybe some withdrawals were going on is not entirely clear. What we do know, though, is that Alfred was not in a stable state of mind when he got behind the wheel to finish his route that day. By late afternoon, Alfred was driving along Highway 87 in rural Sabine County when his truck's engine overheated and gave out. He pulled off the road and into the parking lot of the CL&M grocery store. This was a small roadside convenience store located about 4 miles south of Hemp Hill off of Highway 87. The store was tiny, but it did have gas pumps and a small inside shopping area and a surveillance camera system. Alfred parked his truck and immediately called his wife. He told her that the truck had broken down and exactly where he was, but Lauren couldn't get to him right at that moment, so she called Alfred's parents, Douglas and Rosalind, to go pick him up. His parents got in the car and immediately started toward Highway 87 to go get their son. At some point during their drive, Lauren called Alfred back, or he called her. Reports have conflicted on who called who, but either way, when they were on the phone, Alfred wasn't talking. There was only heavy breathing and then silence. Lauren called his name, but there was no answer. She called again, and nothing. She began to panic, so she sent a string of worried text messages, one after the other, saying, "Trying to get a hold of you, please answer the phone." Then she said, "I'm so worried about you, answer me." Then finally she said, "Your parents are at your truck trying to get to you." Alfred never responded to any of his wife's texts that day. He was gone. Just moments before, the clerk at the store had been standing outside for a smoke break while Alfred was still there at his truck. She said that she saw Alfred get out of the truck, then he was standing near the vehicle in the parking lot. Then she watched him tuck his cell phone into his pocket, and then he took off running north along Highway 87 on foot. He was running away from the store and away from the direction that his parents were coming from. She said she could not understand why he was running because there was nobody else there but him. He was just running. When Douglas and Rosalind Wright arrived at the CL&M just a few minutes later, Alfred's truck was still sitting in the parking lot where he'd left it, but he was nowhere to be found. They called out for him and they searched around the store, but in the area, they found nothing. They called the Sabine County Sheriff's Office to report their son missing immediately. Alfred Wright had been gone for less than an hour, but he never returned to the truck. The police began to search the area immediately, and on November 10th, so just 3 days into the search, they found Alfred's belongings on a private ranch located just a few miles from the store. They found his scrub shirt, pants, watch, and wallet. These items were scattered in a remote pasture on that property. Alfred's body was found on November 25th, so 18 days after he disappeared, in a separate search. Lauren, Alfred's parents, and all their family and friends were completely shocked and horrified at everything that was going on. They had so many questions, and their whole world had just fallen apart at the news of losing Alfred. He was found on a narrow trail in a wooded section of that same property that his belongings were at, about 260 yards west of the farmhouse on the land, and only 25 yards from where they had set up the search command post. He was found wearing only his boxers and both shoes. His phone was tucked into his right sock, and his truck keys were inside his left shoe. A single silver dime was found on the edge of the trail near his body, but there was no explanation for how or why that ever ended up there. The state of his body was another story, though, so before we continue on with the investigation, we need to pause here for not one, but two autopsies. This is about to be very detailed and granular, so just be prepared. Alfred Wright's body was transported from the scene on November 25, 2013, and the autopsy was performed the following day on November 26th. The exam was conducted by Dr. John W. Ralston, and Texas Ranger Danny Young was present and supervising on behalf of the state's investigation. Alfred's body was in an advanced state of decomposition consistent with extended outdoor exposure, and remember, he was outside for 18 days before they found him. His face and neck showed significant soft tissue damage, and the ME stated that this came from insect and animal scavenging activity. He did not classify any of the soft tissue findings as coming from some type of violence like an attack. He also documented that Alfred was missing both of his eyes, his left ear, and his tongue, and that he showed evidence of dental changes as well, meaning he was missing teeth. The first ME said that each of these findings were connected to postmortem activity and not from violence that occurred while he was alive. Dr. Ralston documented 6 shallow puncture wounds on Alfred's body too. The wounds were very small, at about 0.2 inches in diameter each. These were described in reports to be about the size of the tip of a pencil. Their specific locations were in the palm of Alfred's left hand, his lower abdomen, his left thigh, and his left lower leg. Texas Ranger Danny Young examined the barbed wire fence on the private ranch property where his body and belongings had been found, and they confirmed that the barbs on the fence were consistent in size and pattern with the puncture wounds that were found during the autopsy. This supported the idea that Alfred had passed through or fallen against that fence at some point during his final hours. Dr. Ralston found no broken bones anywhere in Alfred's body, so there were no fractures to the skull, face, ribs, or to his arms and legs. There was no documented blunt force trauma to the skeletal structure whatsoever, and this is a significant negative finding because that can be the difference between homicide or a natural death. The absence of skeletal trauma was a key pillar in supporting the official conclusion that no violent attack occurred in the death of Alfred Wright. The toxicology analysis was performed, and the results confirmed 3 controlled substances in Alfred's blood: coke, amphetamines, and Xanax. These were all purchased from his dealer on November 13th, which is the day that everything else transpired. All 3 were present at levels of recent and consistent use, and we're going to dive into what each of these do to the system and thought process in a second, but the toxicology report also documented markers consistent with chronic, long-term use of these substances. Chronic exposure leaves biological markers in the cardiovascular system, in the airway tissue, and in metabolic patterns that show repeated sustained use over a significant period of time. This was consistent with Hadnot's admission that he'd been selling Alfred coke on a daily basis since at least early October of 2013. Now I want to talk about what each of these do in the body because understanding what these 3 substances do together is essential to understanding this case. Coke basically overstimulates your brain and body. Normally, your brain releases chemicals like dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin to send signals, then quickly cleans them up so the signal stops. This drug blocks that cleanup process. So, those chemicals just sit there and keep firing way longer than they're supposed to. That's why people feel an intense high. But it also puts your body into a lot of stress. Your heart starts beating faster, your blood pressure goes up, and your blood vessels tighten. The high itself doesn't last for a very long time, usually anywhere between 20 minutes to about an hour or hour and a half. But if someone keeps taking more throughout the day, then their body stays in that high stress, overstimulated state for hours. Amphetamines work differently though, because the end result is an even more intense and longer lasting high. Instead of just blocking that cleanup process of the brain chemicals, these actually force your brain to dump huge amounts of dopamine and norepinephrine at the same time. On top of that, amphetamines also block the cleanup process. So now you have a flood of these chemicals hitting your brain nonstop. That's why the high is stronger and lasts longer than the previous drug. But it also puts your body under extreme stress. One of the biggest dangers of this drug category is actually overheating. It basically flips your body's heat production system on without ever knowing how to shut it off. Your temperature can spike to 104, 105, 106 degrees Fahrenheit. At that point, it's not just uncomfortable, it is life threatening. Organs like the brain, liver, and kidneys can start getting damaged. You can have seizures from that elevated body temp, and even worse, you can die. People oftentimes feel like they're burning up from the inside, and it's common for them to start taking off their clothes without really even thinking about it. That reaction shows up again and again and again in severe stimulant overdose cases. Now, to add the final drug in the mix, alprazolam or Xanax is a depressant. It's commonly given for anxiety or procedures, and it slows the brain down by boosting a calming chemical called GABA. On its own, it reduces anxiety and makes you feel relaxed or sleepy. But when someone already has a lot of stimulants in their system, Xanax can't balance it out. They're working on totally different systems within the brain. So instead of canceling each other out, you end up with a dangerous mix inside of the body. The stimulants are pushing the body into overdrive with the heart racing, overheating, and high stress, while the Xanax is dulling the brain's ability to think clearly, control your impulses, and recognize what's actually happening. It's like flooring the gas pedal, but taking away the driver's ability to steer the car. This combination can lead to something called delirium. That can look like extreme agitation, paranoia, hallucinations, confusion, and erratic behavior. The person may not recognize the people around them or even be able to respond to basic instructions. Their body temperature is spiking and they may start taking their clothes off because they feel like they're overheating and burning up from the inside. At the same time, their heart is under intense strain. Even in a young, otherwise healthy person, that level of stress can trigger a sudden fatal heart rhythm. That's the kind of physical and mental state that Alfred's body may have been in during his final moments. What's still unclear at this point in today's video, though, is whether or not that explains everything that happened to him. To close out the first autopsy, under the pathological diagnoses section of the report, Dr. Ralston listed the cause of death as combined drug intoxication, and the manner of death was listed as an accident. When the preliminary autopsy results were released publicly in early January of 2014, the response from the Wright family was that they were in complete shock. They didn't agree with the findings, and they rallied for support for further answers. The family's attorney said that the presence of drugs in Alfred's system fails to explain the very apparent trauma that was found on his body. The attorneys also raised a procedural objection because the Texas Rangers had explicitly told the Wright family that their agency had not yet reached a final conclusion in this investigation, and yet the pathologist's manner of death finding was clearly an accident, was being released to the public, but the investigation hadn't concluded that it was an accident just yet. The Rangers confirmed in their own December 27th press release that they had not reached a conclusion and that they were not endorsing the autopsy findings. Because of the growing distrust and outright not believing the first autopsy's findings, Dr. Leanne Grossberg, who is a forensic pathologist based in Houston, was retained by the Wright family. They hired her to conduct an independent second exam on Alfred's body. The family actually requested her to just observe the first autopsy as an independent witness, but that request was denied by Sabine County. I found that very strange because now Alfred's remains would have to go through a full second exam, delaying him being laid to rest, and this also causes continued suffering for the family. Let me know if you also found that strange that she wasn't allowed to simply observe the first autopsy. Dr. Grossberg conducted the second exam in December of 2013. She presented her preliminary findings at the press conference at the Bernson Law Firm in Beaumont, and what she found was dramatically different from Dr. Ralston's report, so let's get into it. Dr. Grossberg said that in her professional judgment, she found evidence consistent with homicidal violence. She described Alfred's eyes as having been gouged out, and his tongue was absent in a manner that she found highly suspicious. She also documented what she described as a slashed or cut throat, which is not a finding that appeared in Dr. Ralston's report anywhere. This specific detail was very concerning, so much so that it made its way to CNN. Texas Rangers said that that incision on Alfred's throat was a surgical cut made by Dr. Ralston's team during that first autopsy as just a standard part of the exam. However, Dr. Ralston had not documented making any such incision anywhere in his published autopsy report. And Dr. Grossberg said that she didn't make that incision either. The Wright family pointed to this unresolved detail as one of the most disturbing loose ends in this entire case, and it still has no explanation. Dr. Grossberg also documented that multiple teeth were missing, but that she felt that they appeared to have been knocked out. There were also no facial injuries to suggest that he fell, causing those teeth to fall out either. The second ME felt that they were removed or knocked out by someone else. She also documented the removal of Alfred's left ear, and then she said, quote, "Based on the investigation, I have a high index of suspicion that this is a homicide. I base that opinion on the circumstances surrounding his death, how and where the body was found, and my findings at the autopsy. My examination was limited due to somewhat advanced decomposition of the body and due to the fact that it was a second autopsy, but I did see findings that were suspicious for homicidal violence," end quote. She also said that trauma could not be definitively ruled out, and she made clear that she could not reach a final, fully informed conclusion without access to the original autopsy photos that were taken by Dr. Ralston's team. Those original pictures were being withheld from her. The Sabine County Sheriff's Office and the Texas Rangers refused to provide them to Dr. Grossberg because they said that this was an ongoing investigation. Are forensic pathologists not involved as a critical part of investigation, though? The family's attorney said that this refusal was obstruction of the independent review that they had commissioned, which is true. Without the original pictures of Alfred, Dr. Grossberg could not fully determine which of the findings that she was observing in December had already been present in November. There would be postmortem changes between the two exams, so it was critical that she was given access to those pictures. The independent toxicology report from the family's second autopsy also identified one additional substance, and that was the use of anabolic steroids. The use of steroids would only worsen everything else that was found in Alfred's system, but they didn't play a significant role as much as the other medications did in his system. I only wanted to mention it mainly to highlight that it was missed in the first toxicology report. Now, to go back to the investigation and what was found on November 7th, Alfred's truck was not searched or processed in those first hours or even in the first days. The family's attorney and private investigator shared with the public that law enforcement had not searched the vehicle that Alfred was driving the night that he went missing. That is obviously concerning because, as we know, time is of the essence. The PA that they hired was Chuck Foreman, and he was a former Army Special Operations veteran, and he founded the Center of Search and Investigation. This is a Texas nonprofit organization that assists families in searching for their missing loved ones. Let's talk about the truck for a minute, though. This was Alfred's workplace vehicle and the vehicle that he drove to every patient appointment on his last day of life. It contained anything that he had with him, touched, or used. If someone had been in that truck with him, they may have left fingerprints, DNA, hair, or fibers behind. And if Alfred had been using drugs in or near the truck, then residue and paraphernalia should have been present too. If there had been a struggle near the truck, then trace evidence of that struggle could have also existed inside of it. Whatever that truck had inside of it, though, it was not collected timely, and by the time anyone looked seriously at it, weeks had already passed by. The CL&M storage surveillance system was present at the location, but the recording from the window of time that Alfred was there was long gone by the time investigators finally went to go collect it. No explanation for the disappearance of that footage has ever been provided either. That footage would have been the most important single piece of evidence in this entire investigation. It would have shown Alfred's behavior, his physical state, the direction that he ran, and whether or not any other person was present inside that parking lot during that time. It also would have shown if maybe someone had followed him. Its absence is one of the most significant unresolved gaps in this case. The initial search, which lasted only 4 days, included deputies, dogs, and aerial coverage. The reason that that initial search was only 4 days, by the way, was because the sheriff decided to call it off. According to Alfred Wright, the police called it a classic drug case. Property owners whose lands fell within the search zone were not reached out to, their doors weren't knocked on, and the land where Alfred's body was eventually found was not searched either. That property owner told Chuck Foreman that no law enforcement officer had ever approached him. Canvassing the neighborhood and requesting to search is one of the most basic steps in any missing persons investigation, especially in rural areas. These basic steps not being done also hasn't been addressed either. When searchers found some of Alfred's belongings on that private ranch, the location where they found and the path between the location of where Alfred's body was discovered was not treated as a potential crime scene. If Alfred had been assaulted on or near that property, or if someone had brought him there or through it, then the evidence of that, like footprints, tire impressions, drag marks, or blood, would have been there. By the time the official search had ended and independent searchers started working, the scene had already been contaminated and the time window was nearly gone. When Alfred's body was found on November 25th, the scene led to even more questions that law enforcement still hadn't addressed. When Sabine County deputies arrived on scene, there was an effort to move Alfred's body directly to a funeral home in Hemp Hill immediately. That is not the normal procedure unless it's a natural or accidental death. Assuming what happened before fully investigating in any case leads to an improper investigation. It doesn't take someone with experience as an investigator to understand that very simple concept. Alfred's father, Douglas Wright, refused this, though. He stood his ground in one of the most devastating moments of his life while literally standing over his dead son, and he insisted that a Texas Ranger be present before anybody moved his son's body. That refusal was smart because they needed to observe the scene before Alfred was transported and before anything else had been disturbed beyond what they already had done. The volunteers and family members who found Alfred, so the eyewitnesses to the discovery of his body, were not interviewed by law enforcement right away either. Texas Ranger Danny Young confirmed to the family's attorneys that even after 45 days of Alfred's discovery, they still had not taken statements from any of the search party that located him. 45 days. These were the people that firsthand saw his body in its original position, saw his condition, and noticed specific details about the scene around him. Their firsthand observations were primary evidence that should have been collected while it was fresh. Formal statements from Alfred's family were also not taken. Lauren Wright spoke to Alfred in his final moments, and she also recorded a conversation with Hadnot days after the disappearance. She also knew Alfred's recent behaviors and his patient schedule and his professional contacts, but she was not formally interviewed right away by the Sabine County Sheriff's Office. So, as you can see, we have a running theme here of major missteps by the investigation when it comes to evidence preservation and priority here. This leads me to believe that, as we've seen in many other cases, the police decided that this case was accidental from the very beginning and investigated it from that perspective. This doesn't change what actually happened, but it does change whether or not an accurate outcome can be reached. Let me know if that's what you're thinking too. The family was outraged, and they made their frustrations public. Sheriff Maddox held his own press conference to push back against the narrative that was building around Dr. Grossberg's preliminary findings. He said, quote, "His throat was not cut. His throat was not slashed. His tongue was not cut out. We have to go with not only what the original autopsy report said, but there were also other pathologists that were looking at this other than the original one, including some very renowned pathologists, and all of them agreed and concurred with the original autopsy," end quote. He maintained that there was no cover-up, no conspiracy, and that the investigation had been conducted based on good authority. He also expressed genuine sympathy for Alfred's family and said, "Parents do not have a son today. A wife does not have a husband, and kids do not have a father. I mean, that's the tragedy that ought to be reported here, not because of some conspiracy and cover-up, but because there wasn't one." Then, in May of 2014, Dr. Grossberg submitted her final completed report. She did this without a press conference and without even notifying the family in advance, which is uncommon given the fact that they hired her. When the family's attorneys got the report, they found that Dr. Grossberg had changed her conclusion. This was a major plot twist compared to what they knew about her initial findings. Her final report agreed with Dr. Ralston's findings. Alfred Wright's death, in her professional opinion, was an accidental drug overdose. She left in the caveat that trauma couldn't be definitively ruled out, but the high suspicion that this was homicide and that she had publicly stated in December 2013 was nowhere to be found in this final report. Cassilia Wright, Albert's sister, said that after the DOJ got involved, she, Dr. Grossberg, basically changed her findings to match theirs. She added that Dr. Grossberg had confirmed in her initial exam that Alfred's injuries were consistent with homicidal violence, and that she later walked back that idea because the family believed that external pressure was coming from the DOJ rather than new forensic findings. To their point, I wondered if maybe Dr. Grossberg finally got access to those initial photos that she'd been requesting, and maybe that led her to changing her position, but she made no mention of those photos in her report either. So I don't understand why she completely changed her take, especially when she was so public about her preliminary report. Because of the missteps during the investigation and frustration from the Wright family, the U.S. Attorney's Office put together a multidisciplinary expert review. Dr. Sparks Veazey is a forensic pathologist with no prior connection to either the county exam or the family's independent exam, and he was asked to review both autopsy reports as a third set advised. Dr. Veazey also agreed with Dr. Ralston's findings. He didn't identify anything in the report that was inconsistent with the accidental cause of death finding. Forensic anthropologists were also consulted specifically on the decomposition timeline. The question that they were specifically hired for was if the state of Alfred's body, when found, was consistent with 18 days of outdoor exposure. Their conclusion was that yes, he had been outside for 18 days. This contradicted the family's belief, as well as the CNN medical expert that talked about Albert's case on Anderson Cooper, that Alfred's body appeared to have been outside for a matter of days and not weeks. So, the Wrights and the CNN expert felt that there was potential foul play involved because they felt he had been placed there, but now we have a forensic anthropologist weighing in saying otherwise. A forensic toxicologist named Dwayne C. Fuller was also retained by the U.S. Attorney's Office to review both autopsy reports and both sets of toxicology results, and the additional experts' opinions as well. On July 28, 2014, Fuller submitted his final analysis. He also concluded that Alfred's death was consistent with combined drug intoxication and excited delirium. He specifically found that excited delirium is the most commonly induced side effect of stimulant drugs and manifests as delirium, agitation, anxiety, and hallucinations. He specifically pointed out that in many excited delirium cases, the dangerously elevated body temp causes the affected person to take off their clothes. He also added that the behavior that Alfred was displaying at the store, like running away without any apparent reason, failing to respond to his wife on the phone, and the follow-up calls, was consistent with this clinical picture. Fuller's analysis was the final major expert opinion that was incorporated into the federal record before the indictment was announced. The completed expert record pointed in one clear direction, and that was that Alfred's death was an accident. This is the official finding to this day. That is what multiple credentialed experts agreed on after nearly a year of review, and the Wright family has never accepted it. They never will. And if you consider the failed search, the missing footage, the withheld photos, the reverse conclusion, the dime on the trail, the strangely placed belongings, and the condition of Alfred's body, I think we can understand exactly why they struggle to accept that. The case surrounding Alfred Wright's death didn't end in a murder trial or civil rights prosecution, but it did end in a federal drug case against Shane Dwayne Hadnot. Prosecutors charged Hadnot with selling the drugs that were found in Alfred's system on the day that he disappeared, initially charging him with serious counts that could have led to decades in prison. The indictment brought in the text messages, recorded conversations, and admissions tying Hadnot to supplying the drugs, and it framed Alfred's behavior that day as a drug-induced excited delirium. Despite the investigation led by the FBI and DEA, officials acknowledged that the case would not resolve the deeper questions surrounding Alfred's death. His family strongly rejected the outcome, arguing that his injuries pointed to a violent assault and that Hadnot was being used as a scapegoat rather than them finding the true perpetrators that needed to be held accountable. In December 2014, Hadnot pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of drug possession with intent to distribute. The more serious charges, like those linking his actions directly to Alfred's death, were dropped. He was sentenced in April 2015 to 87 months in prison, so just over 7 years, and he was never convicted of Alfred's death. No one has ever been charged with murder or any violent crime in connection to Alfred Wright's death. A federal civil rights investigation was also closed without any charges or any findings of racial motivation. At the end of this case, there are two truths that exist side by side. The official record tells a clear story that Alfred Wright had been using substances, which led to an untimely accidental death. But that explanation does not answer everything. It does not explain how his body went unnoticed for 18 days in an area that had already been searched, only to be found less than 30 yards from their command post. It does not explain the missing surveillance footage from the last confirmed place that he was seen, and it also doesn't account for how his personal belongings were found either. And last but certainly not least, the outcome does not explain the conflicting interpretations of his injuries or the questions surrounding the condition of his body when he was finally discovered. For Alfred's family, they were left with an official answer that they don't believe to be true. And for them, there are too many holes in this investigation. Trust was irrevocably destroyed. Alfred Wright lost his life at only 28 years old. He was a husband, father of three, a son, a brother, and a physical therapist trying to build a life in East Texas. Whatever struggles he had, whatever choices he was making, none of it changes the fact that this death was an absolute tragedy, and it was never fully explained in a way that satisfied the people who knew him best. So, now that you know his story, let me know what your thoughts are on today's case and what you think happened, and whether or not you feel this was a thorough enough investigation. I'm sending Alfred and his family so much love, and I pray that Alfred is resting peacefully. Thank you so much for listening to Alfred's story today and for hanging out with me. Don't forget to leave me a case recommendation down below in the comments because I am currently working double time to research for maternity leave cases. My only request is no cases involving kiddos, please, because I think I'm just too emotional for that at the moment. I am so grateful for each and every one of you. So please take the best care of yourselves this week. Nurse's orders. Oh, and don't forget to drop a butterfly in the chat if you made it this far into today's video. I'll see you next time. Bye.